Welcome, everyone, to our new episode on the Living Life Naturally podcast. Thrilled to have you here today. And since we're going to be talking about eating disorders today as part of this, I also want to remind you that I do a free call for my listeners to do with a healthy way of eating when it comes to your emotions. So I will put that in the show notes, and I will be putting our special guests' information in the show notes for you today. And all the way from San Francisco today, we have Dr. Cristina Castagnini, and she is a clinical expertise physician when it comes to treating patients. She's been doing this 25 plus years. She helps them with a variety of mental health diagnoses, supervising postdoctoral residents, and she holds a position as the lead eating disorder specialist at a major hospital. She's been doing that for over 15 years. Her continued passion for helping others and spreading awareness about mental health issues led to the opening of her own private thriving practice, and also to her hosting a weekly podcast, Behind the Bite. So I hope that you will hop on over to her podcast and give it a listen. So Dr. Cristina, we're thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Lynn. Appreciate it.
So it looks like you've got a beautiful view out there of sunny San Francisco. It does look sunny today.
Yeah, this has been rare. We've had some ups and downs with the weather. I think it's going to rain soon again, but I'll take it today. So, yeah.
I think that we've had that all over the country with some very unusual. I know here in Florida, ours has been unusually up and down. I mean, we're usually in the full flow of summer by now, or what is our summer. And we had some days last week we were still getting outside for our coffee in the morning in the 50s and wearing lightweight sweatpants. So
yeah, I'm with you there.
It's weird.
It is.
So what brought you into this specific area that is now your expertise when it comes to eating disorders?
So I think like a lot of people who specialize in treating eating disorders, many of us have a history of our own experiencing eating disorders. Certainly that's the case for myself. Starting from a pretty young age, I have my own history of why I felt uncomfortable with my body. I was born with some birth defects. And so I always felt like something was wrong with my body, something was wrong with me because of having those. But then puberty hits, and there was just a perfect storm of a lot of things that felt very out of control. With the hormones, my body was becoming, a woman's body, and it felt very out of control. And then I had moved from one city to another, and they were very different. I missed all my friends as it was the middle of fifth grade, which was horrible. We moved from one place where I had all these friends to a location where we were literally like the only house in a new development. We had nobody around us. So I felt very isolated. And then on top of that, one of my relatives was getting married and wanted me in the wedding wearing a dress that was going to very much expose one of my birth defects. So I just felt like this was a horrible time. So what a lot of eating disorders is really about, it's not really about the food or the weight. It's about trying to take control over something. And my way of I didn't know it at the time. I said, well, maybe if I just lose weight, I'll look better in the bridesmaid's dress. I'll feel better about myself. It was just, I felt very much in control. My mind was so focused and fixated on what I was eating, counting calories, exercising, weighing myself, all of that. My mind was so preoccupied. I didn't have time to think about all the other stuff that was stressful or feel all the stuff that was, coming up for me with all of those things. So it quote unquote worked, if you will. And I thought, great, people were giving me positive feedback. Oh my gosh, you look great, So let's fast forward, many, many, many years later, I was thinking I'm a horrible dieter and failing. diet after diet. And I did not realize I had an eating disorder because back when I had it, there was, well, first, there was no internet. There was none of this anyway, but nobody talked about them. The only thing I knew was Karen Carpenter died of a heart attack. And that was about it, right? There wasn't any awareness, there wasn't any education, there wasn't any information. And so, to your point of why am I doing this, I wish there would have been a lot of discussion. I wish people would have been talking about it. I wish I would have known something other than, hey, I just got to be better at dieting. I have to have more willpower. I just got to find the right one, something. So that's why I'm doing this now.
Yeah. And you're very right. And I remember Karen Carpenter passing away. And of course, it did come out later that she had anorexia. And it was kind of like the first time that people had really come out in the open about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I find the same when I work with women who are in that perimenopause, menopausal phase.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that we just didn't talk about it. Our mothers didn't talk about it. It was just another one of those taboo subjects that really now also has kind of changed, and there's quite a bit of education around it, just as there is with eating disorders. There's a lot more information. However, there's also a lot of disinformation. So, as a word of precaution to our listeners, be careful where you get your information from. So, yes. First of all, I want to ask you if anybody can fully recover from an eating disorder.
Yes, I love that you asked that question, because I know there's so many myths out there, like you said, misinformation. And that's one of the big things that I love to dispel, is these horrible myths. I always heard this: you can never really get over an eating disorder. You always kind of have it with you. And I'm just going to say to people, please do not believe that, because what you believe is so powerful and it's so true. And if people do believe, okay, I've gone far enough, or I'm so much better, or I'm always just going to have to kind of live with this, then it really keeps people from fully recovering, because they're like, well, this is kind of the best it's going to be. And that's just not true. Of course you can fully recover. That's why, I'm doing this work. I want to instill that hope in people and say, hey, look, I did. Believe me, if I could recover, I think anybody can. So I don't say that lightly. And I mean that. So that's another reason I do this work, is to say, nobody told me that. I was not working with any treatment providers that had an eating disorder. I just trusted blindly what they were saying. And I really think it would have helped me so much further along if somebody had walked the walk and been able to say, hey, you can do this. This is where you can end up. So please, anyone out there listening who thinks like there's a certain point where you can get to and then it's just good enough, that's not true.
So I know that you also advocate when people are struggling with food and with body image. Why should they work with a specialist versus, say, a licensed mental health professional?
So it's interesting. There's so much, again, not known about the mental health field. So I want you guys to think, anyone listening, and you're for yourself as well, then think about when you go to a physician. If you had something wrong with your foot, right? You're not going to go to an oncologist, right? An adult's not going to go to a pediatrician. If you have, cancer, you're going to go to an oncologist. You're not going to go to an OBGYN, right? There's specialties. And that's the same in mental health. We have our specialties. We get extra training. We have extra knowledge of things. And so you're doing yourself a disservice if you have a mental illness like an eating disorder, which I'm going to say it's one of the deadliest mental health illnesses. Mm-hmm. These are not things you take lightly. And there is somebody like myself or many of my other colleagues who have the certifications and gotten the extra training. They really understand the nuances of an eating disorder because they're very complex, and they have a very slippery slope. You can feel like, oh, I've been doing this for years and years and nothing, quote unquote, nothing's wrong. You can even have perfect labs, but they very quickly, your health can decline very quickly to the point where you're in crisis mode. And somebody who's a specialist needs to know what to do, what the signs are, what level of treatment you need, and pick up on the things that a clinician, and I love my colleagues, don't get me wrong, but I have so many colleagues who don't know anything about eating disorders and they don't pick up on the nuances. Like if you say to your patient, oh my gosh, you look healthy. Now, most people think, well, what's wrong with that? You say that to somebody who's maybe got anorexia or nervosa, and that's going to tailspin them out the door to go and restrict, because what they hear in their eating disorder mind is, oh my gosh, I look fat, I gained weight. So there's all of these things that, like, if you don't understand the illness and the nuances of it, you can actually really do, unfortunately, some more harm in the therapy room than good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that, of course, our society really doesn't help, because it's always been so much about a certain way you're supposed to look or a certain weight that you're supposed to be. And I often relate this to, say, myself. So I'm 5'2", and I'm very small boned. If I weigh as much as 118, which I do at the moment, I don't feel good in my body. My body flourishes when it's around 112. And if you can learn to know your own body, that can help. So I've got other friends, they've got different frames to me. They might be 5'2", but they have a different idea of what they need to be. People who are 5'4" might feel they're best at 132 pounds, and that's where they stay and that's where they're comfortable. So when people think about what they have been taught about, and there's a couple of those well-known places that we go to for losing weight, and they tell us, well, this is what your ideal weight is. Do you prescribe to that kind of theory about what your ideal weight is, or are you teaching people to learn to listen to their bodies and get to know their bodies best? Because in the long run, do diets work?
So yes, several questions, which yes. I'll hit on all the points. So say you're not a number. So I always tell people, please get rid of your scale. That's sometimes the hardest thing in the world, because that for so many years for people, it's been this invalidating thing where their emotional state is tied to this number. So if it goes up, it ruins their mood for the day, and it determines what they eat for the day or how much they exercise or what they tell themselves about themselves. Oh my gosh, I screwed up, whatever. Or if it goes down, then suddenly, oh my gosh, I'm having a great day, I feel better. They may allow themselves to eat more, or maybe not exercise so much. Like I call it negotiating with their eating disorder, like just based on that number. And so much is dependent on that number. Same as like size of pants. So numbers mean nothing. I'll just be honest. Like numbers mean absolutely nothing. I don't care what people weigh. So this whole notion of like the BMI, look, it's an archaic statistic from like the 1800s. This statistician from the 1800s of some small town in Belgium was asked by, I think, the mayor of the town, like, can you just give the average height and weight of the people in our town? And that is the BMI. Like, how do we base health? And it's not based on health and weight. It's not anything. Just, it's like saying, your city in Florida, or your block in Florida there, the block you live on, give the average height and weight of all the people that live on your street. What does that have to do with health and weight? Nothing, right? But you're going to like now make it this big thing that you're going to put on every single human being in every country and every culture for all time being. And then say, hey, you got to fit in this box based on this one block that Lynn lives on. And think about it. In the 1800s, people have evolved over time too, right? And the other problem with the BMI is they've shifted the weights down on the scale too. So people have to weigh less than they did before on the other BMI scale. And they're using the BMI in the medical field, not only for health and weight, but as determinants for if people get denied life insurance. So This is a huge problem. I would say, follow the money and look at the political things behind it too. I'm not going to get all political on everybody, but if anyone wants to look at it, it's just a whole bunch of bogus, right? Also looking at it, if you look at a lot of Olympian athletes, they have a lot of muscle mass. So muscle weighs more than anything else. A lot of Olympian athletes are in the obese or higher categories because of their muscle mass. Now, certainly they're not, if you're using it as these categories as what is a determinant of physical health, you're not going to say they're physically not healthy. That makes no sense.
Right.
Likewise, how are you going to say, as you say, you're 5'2"? To your point, sometimes people who are 5'2" have very small bone structures, larger bone structures, cultures, this and that. There's so many different determinants of why people weigh what they weigh. You can't look at anybody and say, like, oh, you look physically healthy based on your weight or your size. Because I certainly know for myself, I was doing a lot of very horribly damaging things to my body to try to become smaller and to get into a smaller body than I was genetically meant to be in. But hey, society was like patting me on the back, like, good job, over exercising, under eating, throwing up, laxative. I mean, you name it, I did it. How, like, I almost died. I mean, and I'm not kidding. It was horrible. I was so unwell. But yet, according to the BMI, I was, so healthy. And society said, you look great. How awful is that? Like, so many people, I say, they are starving themselves into these smaller bodies they're not meant to be in, but the BMI says they're healthy and people are saying, you look great. And then we wonder sometimes, I'm sure you've heard of this too, people like 30 years old, everyone says they were like the healthiest person. They ate so healthy, they exercised all the time, and they dropped from a heart attack, and people go, what happened? I mean, yeah, this is not okay. We need to start talking about this. Like, there's body diversity. People are not all meant to look like one body shape and size that social media puts out there. The diet and beauty industry, Lynn, is $76 billion profitable industry a year. They want us to see these images of what you're supposed to look like. What they create is the image of ideal, and say, hey, everybody has to look like this, or you have no value, no worth. You can't be happy. You're not attractive unless you look like this. Hey, but we're going to keep putting this image out here so everyone thinks it's attainable, right? And it's in the mind's eye. So we're going to make you feel bad if you don't look like this, right? You feel not good enough. And everyone wants this because they sell the image of happiness and desirability and this great life if you have that look and you weigh that much. So people will buy the products. They'll go, on the diets, the programs, do whatever they can to try to achieve that. And they're literally killing themselves because their bodies aren't meant to look like that. And not to mention, a lot of the images you see, they're photoshopped, they're altered, they're filtered, they're whatever. So that's not even an idea, a realistic body that you can achieve. So you're chasing like a carrot.
Yeah. And I know our social media is so rampant with all of these images and all of these sayings and people doing their before and after pictures. And yeah, it's just everywhere. Now, you did mention earlier something about being taught what was a good food and what was a bad food. So is there some truth in that, or is a lot of that myth?
Well, it's certainly a myth. Look, the bottom line is all food is edible. It's fuel. Like, if we just get to the basics, what is the purpose of food? It's to keep us alive. It's fuel, right? It's fuel and nutrition for our bodies. So when people say, think about this, like, how on earth is a food good or bad? I mean, because this is where you hear the term emotional eating. So if you eat whatever you determine is a good food, now you're good, right? You feel good. If you eat, quote unquote, a bad food, now you feel bad. I'm bad. There's guilt associated with that, right? And so that's a huge problem. In fact, I was talking to a patient last night, and she was laughing about, like, oh my gosh, I was out to dinner with my girlfriends this weekend, and they were, oh my gosh, should we be bad and get the dessert? you know, she's aware of all of these things now because she's starting to really work on her eating disorder. But she's like, I had no idea how much this is in our world and in our language, like good food, bad food. And who determines that anyway? Like, I don't know if you remember, but back in the 80s, carbs were king, right? Like, eat all the carbs you want, fats will make you fat, fat's bad. I don't remember where protein went, but like now it's like, don't eat carbs, carbs are bad, It's like, what? Who determines these things? It's so arbitrary. And people will argue with me all the time. Well, there has to be bad food, things that are bad for you. And I said, well, I mean, I think you brought it up earlier. It's like, what feels good in your body? Like, for instance, if you have a peanut allergy and you eat peanuts, that's really going to feel bad. That's a bad food for you. Okay. To me, that's my definition. Or if it's a rotten food or spoiled food, right? If it doesn't taste good to you, that's a bad food for you. Like, I don't like beets. Beets to me, I think some people are like, oh my God, that's a great food, right? To me, I'm like, that's a bad food. I don't put a beet near me. Like, don't, right? But also I tell people, think about, you want to feel better physically and emotionally after you're done eating than before. So if you feel great, if all you eat is quote unquote, whatever, typical food people think of that's good, is like salad, but emotionally you're feeling deprived because you really want something else, you're going to end up binging later because you can only go feeling deprived for so long. Likewise, if all you eat is like cookies, maybe you'll feel emotionally like satisfied, but physically over time, if all you eat is cookies and that's all you give your body, you're going to feel pretty sluggish and like not think well and like tired. You're going to need a variety. So the body's not just, people go, oh my gosh, if you tell me I can eat whatever I want, you're telling me to binge. And I'm like, no, like that's where the intuitive eating part comes in. It's like your body will tell you how you feel after you eat. Nobody's just going to eat one type of food at every sitting. It's just not going to happen.
Right. I love intuitive eating because it, especially if you've been an emotional eater, getting to know your body and learning intuitively what your body wants to me, it's a form of freedom, because as you say, people have told us, oh no, the dessert is bad. But if you're going to deprive yourself or starve yourself, as you also said, then you get into the binge eating. So if you, this is my philosophy, if you go out to eat and you want a piece of cake or cherry cake or something for dessert, what does it hurt one time? Now, you might eat that and you might feel really lousy afterwards, and then you've got to start rethinking, okay, if I go for dessert, that's not the best dessert for me. But when you know how your body reacts to certain foods, it really is an awesome thing.
Right. And again, it's like even these labels of dessert and lunch. And I mean, it's like, what if we just got rid of the labels and just said, I think one of the most eye-opening things for me in my treatment was really like having a meal plan and having meals that incorporated like, oh, such a variety of foods. Not only did I really kind of get my eyes open to like what a meal is and realize like I was floored by how little I was eating, which I thought from society, like, oh, I was eating so much. I was not eating near enough. But also when on my, like, say I was eating dinner, there was, a cookie and salad and like meat. There was like a variety of things on the plate. It wasn't like whatever we would call dessert food, right? A cookie was like something I had to eat through to earn later, or I waited to eat. And if you think about that, that makes some sense, because a lot of times we teach our kids, right? You got to eat your vegetables and then you get dessert.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time they eat their vegetables and their dinner and then they get dessert, they're probably not even physically hungry anymore. Now they're overeating.
Mm-hmm.
And they're learning like the difference between like good food, bad food. I get this treat. Now food's become this treat thing I earn instead of it just becoming something that's part of your meal, right? I kind of like those old Hungry Man meals. You remember those? And they had like everything
Yes,
in it, right? They even
everything.
had like, everything was in it. Kind of like that concept. It's like, why does it have to be all separate?
Yeah, and I think that, because I was brought up with a different way of thinking about your food in England, and we weren't ever told you've got to eat that before you can have that.
Mm.
The British culture back then was, you're going to have your dinner and then you're going to have a dessert. And very few people in England, from the way that the produce was so healthy, very few people were overweight. And when I first came to the States and I looked around at people, I'm not saying this from a judgy perspective because they have the same thing in Britain now that fast food's so prevalent. But it was an eye-opener to me to see such obese people, and I couldn't figure out why they were obese. And a lot of it is because nobody ever educates people on the whole process of eating, or what eating's about, or when is your body full? Do you know when your body feels full? I didn't know it took 20 minutes for my mind to get to my stomach that, hey, you've had enough to eat. There are so many myths around eating, as you say, and around foods, but our culture was a lot different to what it would be, say, over there nowadays.
Right. And we can get into all sorts of things about like these labels, even, right? Like we're such a fat phobic society too, right? Like even using these words obese and like what that means. And it's so like damaging. And, sometimes we don't even take into consideration, like sometimes people are just genetically in larger bodies and they're extremely physically healthy, mentally healthy. They're not overeating. Like that's to my point too, is kind of like take a step back and say like, there's so much judgment on people too, saying, oh, they must be overeating. They must be whatever, letting themselves quote unquote go. And that's not always the case. But also just looking at too, it's like, I always look at the why. Why are people eating the way they're eating? There's something under it. Like I had mentioned to you, like I was trying to control things, right? Is somebody turning to food for something other than physical hunger? If you're not eating because you're physically hungry, to your point, like people don't know if they're physically hungry or full, then you're eating out of some other tank, like some emotional tank. Are you looking for comfort? Are you looking to numb out, to escape? What is food if it's not for like nutrition and fuel? You have a different relationship with food, and it does something else for people. Certainly, when, for example, if people have binge eating disorder and they're binging, it's this lack of control they have over the eating, and they're really just kind of in a dissociative state where they're not even present or tasting the food. It's numbing out, escaping, not feeling anything that's going on in their lives in those binge moments. So you have to really look at what's really happening with the behavior as well.
Yeah, and obesity is relative. When I was, I guess, in my late 20s, early 30s, I had to have gallbladder surgery. If I was in that position today, I wouldn't have gallbladder surgery because I know enough about how I can eat better to allow my body to heal itself. But nevertheless, I was absolutely shocked, as say 5'2", 135 pounds. And when I read my medical notes, they had described me as being grossly obese.
Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, but what? That's
Yeah.
horrible.
So if
See?
you don't think that, I mean, that really probably had an impact on where I got to into my worst stages of an eating disorder. To be labeled that at 135 pounds is really crazy.
Right. I'm so glad you said that because, right, like the labels, these words, they're derogatory. They have such a horrible impact. Like, oh, that's awful. Like, I'm sorry you experienced that, but I know other people experience that too. And it's
Yeah.
like, can we just get rid of the BMI for this reason alone? It's
Yeah.
awful.
It is all crazy, crazy, crazy. So I know that you have a free resource for our listeners. Could you tell us a little about that?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I have a 9-week email course. It's free on my website. Basically, you sign up once a week. You'll get an email with some questions to ask yourself. Because oftentimes people will say, "Well, do I have an eating disorder? Do I not? Do I need help?" And this isn't a diagnostic tool. It's not going to give you a diagnosis. But what it is it's going to help you understand yourself a little bit more, maybe make some decisions. Do I want to go get help? Um, because I think that that's a big question for people. And just maybe open your eyes like, no, I'm beyond the point of like dieting. Like, um, this is something else. This is really a struggle. This has taken over my life.
Mm. And then you said something that would beg me to ask this question for our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So then you feel that you've got a problem and you know you have to go for help.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that our Western doctors are very helpful. They'll send you to a dietitian or a nutritionist. So where would people look to go get the right kind of help?
Thank you for asking that. Yes, again, there are dietitians and nutritionists who are like certified in treating eating disorders, and I highly, highly recommend only seeing a nutritionist or dietitian who is specializing in eating disorders because I have seen time and time again people just say, well, what does it matter? I'm going to go see any nutritionist, or my insurance only covers this nutritionist or dietitian on my panel. That can be more damaging than
Mm.
anything because oftentimes they're very focused on losing weight or like actually I call it prescribing the eating disorder, like counting calories and portions and this and that. It's just it makes it worse. So yes, finding someone who's certified there, you know, if you Google in IADEP, IAEDP, they are the International Academy of Eating Disorder Professionals. There's a list of certified professionals that you can find in your area. Um, Certainly, if anyone wants to reach out to me and ask for referrals or something, or even work with me, more than happy to help somebody find help. Um, but I think there's a lot. Thankfully, there's a lot more resources out there now.
Mm.
So,
And if people did want to work with you, how is the best way to contact you about that?
I have my podcast website. It's behindthebitepodcast.com. And on there, there's a place where you can reach out to me. Also have my private practice website. You can actually just make an appointment for an intake. It's freedomtowellness.com.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate all of this input. And if you could give our listeners one parting tip, what would that be?
So, oh gosh, there's so many. um, I think we are lacking self care and self compassion. So I just really want anybody out there listening to just ask yourself, like, how hard am I on myself? I think everyone's their own worst critic. You're probably saying things to yourself that you would never in a million years say to anybody you love. And so maybe just take some time and think, man, all the things I'm saying to myself about myself, things that I would say to like my 5-year old daughter, niece, whatever, like, how would they react if I said all of those things to them? Because that has an impact. And so maybe just rethink that and try to be a little bit nicer to yourself.
So I will put all the information in the show notes for everybody. I really appreciate you being here with us today. And it's always interesting to me to talk about this subject. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you so much for passing on all of your knowledge and education to our listeners today.
Well, thanks for having me, Lynn. Appreciate it.
Thanks. You have been listening to the Living Life Naturally podcast, where we're on a mission to inform, inspire, and encourage women to live their best life confidently, joyfully, and freely from what's been holding them back. For show notes and free resources, visit holistic-healthandwellness.com. And I'd be delighted if you'd follow us on socials to connect further. If you enjoyed this show, why not share it with your friends? If you found good value, chances are they will too. And of course, a 5-star review on iTunes is always greatly appreciated, as much as I appreciate you listening. So until next time, live life naturally and joyfully.